Hello, and welcome back to our podcast, What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues,
David Kennedy
and Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And so here we are in season 2 now, and we have a special guest today. I heard her on a podcast that I was listening to. I went and got her book and told David and Red we should read the book. And then I went searching to find her on the internet and see if I could track her down to be a guest on our podcast. And she very graciously said yes. So it's MaryCatherine McDonald is here with us today. MC, yes. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I was so glad that you did reach out across the interwebs to find me, because then I got the opportunity to be introduced to your podcast, which I love. So I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just do, that formal thing that we do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read your bio, a few sentences of that. And just also because we're going to be referencing your new book a lot during this podcast. And I want to make sure that we speak to that so that people can go out and give it a read, because it's a really good read. So
what's the title of that new book, Julie?
It's called Unbroken. The Trauma Response is Never Wrong, and Other Things You Need to Know to Take Back Your Life. So, and it's by MaryCatherine MC McDonald, PhD, who is a research professor and life coach who specializes in the psychology of trauma, stress, and resilience. She has been researching, lecturing, and publishing on the neuroscience, psychology, and lived experience of trauma and stress for over a decade. She's passionate about destigmatizing trauma, stress, and mental health issues in general, as well as reframing our understanding of trauma in order to better understand and treat it. She has a master's degree at the New School, where she researched traumatic loss and mourning, and went on to complete her PhD at Boston University. She's also published several research articles and book chapters, as well as 3 books on trauma. And then this most recent one that we'll be talking about today, that was just released in March 2023. And once again, I'm just going to say it's by Sounds True Publishing. It's called Unbroken. The Trauma Response is Never Wrong, and Other Things you need to know to take back your life. So welcome, MC.
Thank you. Thank you for the lovely intro.
And we were also excited to get a chance to meet you and to hear you talk about it. I just too want to say how much I really appreciated the book. I just couldn't put it down. It was an easy read for all the right reasons. Let me put it that way. And I really would encourage people to read it, because it really you did a wonderful job of taking some complex things and making them understandable for people.
Oh,
so I'd like to start perhaps. You have it in the title, but then you have a great quote early in the book where you say that the trauma response is rooted in strength, not weakness. And I wonder if you could kind of talk about that, and along with that, maybe help us understand a little bit of your story that kind of got you into this work, or in at least intrigued you, and expand perhaps on that idea that trauma is not a weakness, but a strength.
Yeah, I think it actually makes the most sense to start with the story, because then with my story and how I got into this, because then it brings us into this idea of trauma as strength. I was studying grief and mourning in my master's degree program, and I was looking at child loss in particular, and the way that has been looked at, through history. And in the course of doing that work, both of my parents got very ill and died very quickly. And so I was in this really strange situation of studying what I was living through. And it almost felt eerie to this point of like, did I write this into existence? The arrogance, the audacity that I had to take on this, like, I'm going to understand grief. And then the universe is like, haha, how about you live it? And then when I moved into my PhD program, I wanted to expand that and talk about the way that tragedy shapes identity. And so I looked at trauma to look at the way that traumatic events can sort of reveal the structure underneath our lives, because it explodes it. because there's this structure that kind of runs underneath our lives that we take for granted. It's almost like a plumbing system. You don't really think about your plumbing system, but it works and you count on it until it doesn't. And then all of a sudden it's this huge shattering problem. And so I was working in an interdisciplinary way. So I was working in the fields of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience, and trying to develop a really holistic understanding of trauma from all of these disciplines. And I reached for the definition of trauma and realized really quickly that this was something that was not yet decided, that, this is something that the American Psychological Association was still arguing about. And when I started to reach into neuroscience in particular, it started to reveal itself to me that the trauma response, the thing that is the source of what can become symptoms later, is a necessary adaptation that is part of our central programming that we wouldn't have survived without. And so the trauma response, fight, flight, or freeze, are these set of default, it's like our default software. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to handle threat and overwhelm and danger. And so, yes, of course, when those systems go unchecked, they can move from adaptation to maladaptation and create symptoms and pain. But I think when we understand that the source is a sign of strength rather than weakness or disorder, then we can begin the healing process without shame. And I think the difference is, like, if you try to heal with shame, it's like you're trying to climb up a mountain with a car strapped to your ankle. Like, that's just, you're not going to get anywhere. If you can remove the car, you're a lot more likely to get up the hill.
How did that play out in your own story? You write about that in the book, around having to start to work with your own trauma response and how it showed up quite further out after the death of your father. Could you speak about that, just so that we can kind of give an example of how the trauma response can start to cause problems down the road?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a funny process, because when you tell a story, you have the benefit of hindsight. And that's very different than what it's like when you're living through it. And so I sometimes think back on my old self, and I feel for her, because she didn't know what she was going through and why it was so hard and painful. I think that my set of trauma responses got formed in development. I don't talk about this a lot in the book, but just in the way that I grew up, different things that happened, stuff that was going on in our household. And I developed this method of stuffing down everything and moving forward. And if I could be productive, then that meant I was okay. And that worked. It worked with everything. Here I was, getting a master's degree and living in New York, and, being 23 and having my own apartment. And I was so productive and functional and had never looked at anything. And then my father dies, and I was like, okay, I know what to do, right? You go back to work. You throw yourself into things, you continue studying, you write your master's thesis, you take on a logic exam, maybe you learn a language, pile on and pile on and pile on. And then that worked for about 6 months. And then it was just utter collapse. And I was starting to have panic attacks all the time. Looking back, I think I struggled with panic as a kid. But again, learned to manage it with a set of coping mechanisms that worked for a long time. And then the death of my father just shattered everything. And so about 6 months after his death, everything collapsed, and I had to go into therapy and really start rebuilding my whole way of being in the world. Like, it wasn't just this task of grieving one loss. It was like, I have to grieve the loss of my father. I have to grieve the loss of my innocence. I have to grieve the loss of unity in my family system. I have to grieve the loss of all of the things that I believed to be true up until that point. And none of my coping mechanisms work. So I need to grieve those as well and create new ones. So it was a long process. And then hilariously, when I started studying trauma, my professors were very against this, because this was not a moment where we were really talking a lot about trauma, and they thought it was kind of career suicide to take this on. And so I had to really advocate for myself. And they said, if you're going to study trauma, I guess you really should study combat only, because that's something that has been talked about for a long time. And so I got many years into studying trauma and combat trauma before I realized that the things that I had been through were traumatic. And that the symptoms that I was having were not just grief and panic, but they were from, traumatic imprints from the experiences that I had had. And it's humbling. I think we can have, as I'm sure you all know, we can have these tremendous blind spots about our own experience. So yeah, it's a very long way to answer the question, but.
Just to start us off, just because we're already using the word so many times, can you speak about the definition or where you have landed, just to kind of provide that context for us going forward? I think it's a beautiful definition myself, and it made a lot of sense to me.
Yes. It's such an interesting, it's still something that's being debated in the field of psychology right now. And if you take the most strict clinical definition of trauma, there are 3 things that count as potentially traumatic in the DSM, the sort of the Bible of psychology. And it's death, serious injury, and sexual assault. Those are the things. And the DSM gets rewritten every handful of years to account for new research and new technology and things like that. And I actually got to go to some of the meetings when the last edition came out and was being debated about, how do we change the entry for PTSD? What do we need to add and take away? And one of the arguments was about this definition. It's too narrow. There are far more than 3 things that could potentially be traumatic. And of course, clinicians are going to take that and interpret it however they choose. And so many of them will assume that other things can potentially be traumatic, but some of them don't. And then that's a huge problem, because we then don't diagnose people with the correct thing because they don't count as having, exposure to a traumatic stressor. And I always left those meetings thinking, boy, I'm glad I also do philosophy, because I think I have a lot more optimism about the human nature and the capacity of human reason than psychologists, which is kind of funny. But I think because the risk on the other side of the debate is that if anything can be traumatic, then we're all traumatized all the time. And we don't really need to even study trauma, because it's just basically like the common cold. And we really don't want to go that direction, right? We want to make sure that research dollars and studies keep going to this. And so I think we are more capable than the field of psychology thinks to redefine trauma. And so the definition that I use, I've adapted from Robert Stolorow, and he says, look, you have a potential trauma when you have 2 things present at the same time: an unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home. Anytime you have an unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home, you have a potential lasting trauma. It depends on whether you get that relational home, and a lot of other factors as well. But that feels like a beautiful definition to me. And I think it does a lot of work towards getting us to a more expanded definition that isn't, so expansive that we stretch the word to meaninglessness.
And for the listeners, what's a relational home?
Yes, I'm glad you asked.
That might be a phrase or term people
Yes.
haven't heard of before.
Yes, because it's made up.
Way to go.
We do that a lot.
Yeah. That my students sometimes get mad because this term is supposed to have a little bit of vagueness to it, but they want precision, and I think when we go for precision, sometimes we lose something important. A relational home is a space where someone can help you bear the unbearable emotions so that you don't have to bear them on your own. And that yeah, right. And I think we do that all the time. And my students, they'll say, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? And I'll say, okay, tell me what you do when you have a friend who goes through a breakup or they get ghosted by somebody. What's your protocol? And they're like, oh, first we go over to their house and we bring ice cream, and then we eat pizza and we listen to this angry Taylor Swift music. And then we take the guy off their phone and then we go out to the club. Like, they have a whole protocol. Right. And I'm like, okay, that's a relational home. Anytime that we are helping someone, meeting someone in the overwhelm and helping them carry it, that's a relational home. The other reason I love the definition is because it doesn't limit healing to a therapist's office.
That's right.
Because we heal in lots of different ways in all of our relationships. Yeah, sorry.
The reason why that definition so resonated with me is it made me think of some instances with clients early in my career where they taught me to never assume what the trauma was.
Oh.
So I think of a situation I could remember where a traumatic experience happened to my client in her adolescence. It wasn't the experience, it was how her parents responded to that experience with her. That rather than saying, this is awful that happened to you, we will stand with you, we will support you, they responded with shame and with judgment. And what that taught me, and is now, as I never assume what is traumatic for someone, even when I hear it's the, as you say in your book, it's the way we experience, it's not what the event is, it's the way we experience it. And I have also seen the opposite, that I have seen people bear incredibly painful experiences because they were surrounded with a relational home, with a circle of people that said, we are walking with you through this. And I feel like I get to, we get to see this in our hospice work too.
Absolutely. The power of sitting with someone in that darkest moment. Yeah.
And I think when you add to that definition, that concept that you talk about in your book, it's not necessarily the experience, but how, or the event, it's how we experience the event that matters. And so two people might be in a car accident, one person comes out, fine, and another person comes out of there totally traumatized. When you add that idea to that definition, it paints a wonderful picture that is open and caring, right? As opposed to like blaming and shaming.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to a friend actually last night about the grocery store, and it was like, if someone stood too close to you in the grocery store in 2018, this means something. That context is very different than if someone stands too close to you in a grocery store in 2021. And it's like, of course, context matters in all of our experience. If it's your wedding day and it's the best day of your life and you get a migraine, that, the context matters. That's a bigger deal than if you get a migraine on a regular day or work day. And so I think that the fact that we try to, again, we want precision where the experience doesn't allow for it. So we want this really nailed down, tight definition of which things are going to potentially be traumatic, but it really depends. And I think one of the things that has been used to shame the patient in the history of the study of trauma is the fact that two people can come through the same trauma and one of them is struggling and the other one isn't. And so we then turn to the person struggling and say, well, you have a weak will, or there's something wrong with you. And it's instead of saying, well, potentially, these people, yes, they experience the same thing, but in two different ways.
That's right. It wasn't actually the same experience.
Right.
Yeah. The event was the same.
Right.
But it wasn't actually, their nervous system didn't have the same experience of that event.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then plus as you talk about elsewhere, it's the significance of the meaning of that event too.
Right.
And that meaning piece, often, we're surrounded by everybody else giving us the meaning or attempting to give us a meaning that fits their perspective, right?
Right.
And that is such a powerful thing. But that I have found again, and the difficulty with struggling, I mean, even as a therapist, struggling with meaning on your own, it's really difficult. I mean, that again needs a relational home to really process that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's like, it's so central to the human task, is to figure out meaning, and that in itself can be overwhelming and bring us to an existential crisis. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sorry, David.
No, go ahead, Brent.
I was just thinking, Julie, you talked about, the nervous system and the effect on the, I wonder if it makes little sense just to very, very briefly, because the concept of shame and blame and it not being a place that, the response is a place of strength. We're hardwired for this response, right? And so people say, I don't have the will, or I don't have the strength. It's like, well, no, but your brain brain was made and developed for this very purpose.
Right.
Is there a thumbnail sketch or Reader's Digest version that you can sort of have the listeners understand what happens in the brain when we're under stress or when we feel like we're approaching a large threat?
Yes. Okay. So this is great. And I think we can do Reader's Digest for sure. So if your brain, think about your brain like a video game. If your brain was a video game, then its goal would be homeostasis. And all that means is that you have equal blood flow and electrical activity across the cortex. Your brain is an adaptive organ. And so it's always responding to information and data that's coming from inside the house, inside your body, and also from outside in the world. So, your brain is aiming for homeostasis, and its work is to adapt to the circumstances that are going on. And so when you have regular events going on, you have homeostasis, and that means you have, access to most of the parts of your brain relatively easily. You can go back into your long-term memory. You can continue working on a puzzle that you were doing. You can talk to a friend. You can answer your kid when they ask what the Spanish word is for table, right? All of those things are available to you. Maybe more or less, maybe some of them you struggle with, but for the most part, you have access to everything. When you have danger, when you have danger in your perceptual field, whether that danger is real or perceived, you have a smoke alarm in your brain that goes off. And when it goes off, it alerts all of the areas of your brain to adapt. And they do that by turning down 47 different functions, so they can turn up functions that you need when you're in danger. And so they alter blood flow and electrical activity away from homeostasis so that you are more likely to survive. So blood flow gets pulled from the parts of your brain that you don't need, and it goes towards parts of the brain that you do need. So you'll notice like perceptual shifts when that happens. Sometimes you can move faster than usual. You might actually feel stronger. This is all because your brain and your nervous system and your body are adapting to what they perceive to be a threat. We are designed to toggle back and forth. So if someone makes a noise in your house in the middle of the night, you go from your lowest baseline to your highest, right? You go from the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest system, your blood pressure is low, your heart rate is low, respiration is low, to sympathetic nervous system, really high, so that you can handle the threat. And we all know what this feels like because we've all been through that. And then within like 20 or 60 minutes, your system goes back down and you can go back to sleep. So we're designed to toggle back and forth and adapt like that. That is a beautiful adaptive strength response. Issues come about when we get stuck and we are chronically flooded with stress hormones. We're chronically out of that homeostasis in the brain. And then we start to sort of chronically lose access to long-term memory, to concentration, to the ability to regulate our emotions, recognize where we are in space, all of that stuff. And these are the symptoms of a strength adaptation that has become maladaptive. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Sure does.
Absolutely. And so that happens automatically. We don't have to think about it. You don't have to turn that system on.
No,
it just happens.
It just happens. Yep. It happens in your sleep. Like we've all been there, right? You hear something in the middle of the night and all of a sudden your heart rate goes from 58 to 120. Like that doesn't require your input.
And the other thing is that it is automatic and it's fast, and we can't kind of cognitively think our way out of that, can we?
No.
I often think that, sometimes we'll kind of say, well, next time that happens, here's what we can do. Totally. And we come up with all of this logical, I'm going to take a deep breath and then I'm going to do this. But what we don't realize is like that nervous system, I just call that the whoosh, the roar, right?
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I call that like the roar of trauma. And we are just swept away in that moment.
Yep.
And so that's where we cannot think our way out of our nervous system, doing that. We have to find other ways to kind of help the nervous system come out of that response, help it come back to that rest state.
Yep, absolutely. So many of us don't even know that we're in it because,
that's right.
If you go into a fight response, let's say you're at work, something is happening, you're starting to feel really scared, and all of a sudden you go into super aggressive mode. You might not think that might just be how you are at work. Right? It becomes a part of your personality in a way. You don't think of it as a behavioral thing that's coming from a trauma response. And so you can, for a very long time, kind of coast on that and not realize what's happening. We get so detached from our bodily experience, and it's tricky.
Go ahead, Red.
No, you go.
So let's talk about what this means, because this podcast about grief and about loss and, living with life-threatening illness, all of which has, of course, components of trauma interwoven through those stories. So, you have a chapter in the book on traumatic loss. Take us there. What do you want to say about that?
So many things. I'm constantly in conflict with myself about this, because people always go to the question of, are all losses traumatic? And I think I sometimes want to say yes, and I sometimes want to say no, and then I want to say yes again, and then I want to say maybe, and it's confusing. And I know that's annoying for people. Pick a lane, But I think because we live in a grief-phobic society, I think that nearly all losses that happen in this culture are rich opportunities for trauma to take hold, because you've got already the recipe. You have half of the recipe, right? You have the unbearable emotional experience, trying to get your head around a loss that permanent, or a terminal illness, or a diagnosis like that, is already an unbearable emotional experience. And then when that arises in a culture that is grief phobic, where you can't talk about having cancer or what that's like, even though you're in remission and now you're scared about going back. I was listening to the last episode about your journey and how that has been. And people don't want to talk about that. And so you can't find a relational home.
That's right.
And so these things are, I think in this culture, almost always these things are traumatic. But I don't think they have to be.
Well, and we see that our local hospice here, a lot of our bereavement support is done in groups. And we see that when people come together in groups and just have that experience of, you experience that too, so do I, there's a place to put some of that, then they're starting to build a relational home in this world that sometimes doesn't make room for their grief. And we don't know also often how to make room for our own grief.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
You mentioned magic word for me is culture.
Yeah.
And how we live in this culture that shies away, doesn't tend to have a real strong view toward examining that part of being alive. Is that being alive means that someday we're not going to be alive. And so that reminds me of the in your book where you talk about moral injury, and how that moral injury sort of, and that concept of shatters and shards, we were talking a little bit before you came on, how we love the image of shards, and how it sort of can shatter. The death is one thing, but then it shatters our assumptive world, the world that we've made up, that we have joined, and if we're good tenants of this culture, we're going to be safe, and we're going to fit, and we're going to belong, and we're going to feel safe. And it's in a world that, when death happens, sometimes doesn't make us feel so safe. So can you talk a little bit about moral injury?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the easiest way for me to situate that is to talk about how I experienced it, which is that my dad was, I lots of people are not comfortable talking ill of the dead. I have no problem talking ill of the dead when it's appropriate. But my father was one of those people that is just like almost angelic, like almost non-human in how good he was as a human being, like just and I think you can see that in the book too. There's a chapter in particular that dives into that. And so I had held this belief that if you were a good person, that nothing bad could happen to you. And there was actually even the first night he was in the hospital, one of the nurses kept saying, nothing bad's going to happen to him. I can tell he's a good man. Nothing bad's going to happen to him.
Wow.
Right. And so you get this belief, then this belief is strengthened by all this experience that you have in the world. And then all of a sudden it's Christmas morning and my father's dead and nothing makes sense. And so that's what I mean by moral injury, is that like you have this set of beliefs that you don't even realize is holding up the entire world. And then this one thing happens in this 1 second and it's all shattered. And you're left standing there like, what the hell just happened? I didn't even realize that I believed that until the thing shattered. So there's like a horror to that as well. I didn't realize that this structure was holding up the world. And now I have to do this impossible task of figuring out how to put that back together in the absence of the person who I need the most to help me put it back together. And so it was just this like totally tremendous explosion. Sometimes I want to write a book of short stories about how like they will be sort of like fantastical stories of explosions, like my father died, the house exploded, there was a gas leak, you know, because that feels more true than the way it actually happened, you know. And so there's also this way in which the experience doesn't fit in the story, which I think provides another area of moral injury. You can't tell it in the way that it feels. And so that makes the grief start to feel uncommunicable. And then we live in this culture where people don't communicate. Nobody wanted to talk about my dad. Like people couldn't handle it. Someone at work, when I came back, I told her, you know, and this is like, you get 3 bereavement days or whatever, like, great. And so I go back to work trying to be normal. And I had to tell someone at work that it happened, and she collapsed on the floor sobbing, which, you know, was an empathy response and all that. But also then I had to take care of her. People don't handle it well. So you're left with this huge unbearable emotion and you have nowhere to go with it. I was 24. I didn't know anyone else who had lost their parents. And it was just a sort of hollow, lonely place where people just expect you to get back to normal. And it starts to impact them if you're not. If you're having panic attacks, then they're like, you know, you can't do this. You have to keep going. And you're like, okay, I know, but.
Do you hear there all the layers, right, of what people are working through that stretches so far beyond, I miss my dad, I can't believe he's dead, right? And if I could read your work to you, it reminds me of this quote. You said, the truth is we are all terminally vulnerable. Our existence and all the things we hold dear within it are haunted by this vulnerability. Everything is precarious, and we spend most of our lives holding this truth at bay until something like this happens.
Right. And then we find ourselves like on the other side, and we're like,
that's right.
I can't unknow this horror, and I have nowhere to go with it.
And that's the piece where, you know, and as I'm listening to you there, MC, I'm wondering, perhaps that's the way we all are, that it takes those crisis moments to challenge this built up worldview that we've created or been given or evolved into. But half of the problem, it seems to me, that a great deal of the work of grief is that rebuilding of a worldview that takes into account what's happened, because we can't go back to the way it was.
Right.
It's not about rebuilding what was.
Right.
It's about finding, how do I live now knowing and experiencing what this has done to me, my world, and that trauma too can be a challenge of again, without that sense of support and that home that allows us to do that safely. It takes a long time to do that too. It's not a quick thing.
No.
And it's why it's such big, long work, right? Grief is such long work because there's so many components to it.
Right.
Yep. Do you think I don't even think it's ever over. Do you?
I don't think so either. I don't think so either.
You have someone who's grieving the loss of someone and tell them to get over it, and they should kick you, because it's like, it's not about getting over. I will never get over this. I will never forget this person. This person will be a part of my life forever. I'm trying to learn how to live in a world without that person now. I'm trying to live in the world. Maybe they were, that my home, maybe they represented my home, right? My relational home, and now they're gone, and I'm trying to figure that out. It reminds me so much of, I don't know, terror management theory. It's interesting where we develop culture to buffer ourselves and to buffer our death anxiety, and then when something happens, the culture and doesn't support us. And if we live in that death denying culture, where does the support come from when my world is shattered and the shards are on the ground and I'm trying to pick up the pieces?
Right. And then you have this realization that your culture in a way has betrayed you by creating this terror management model where you don't, why don't we talk about this? Why don't we learn how to manage our nervous systems? Why don't we think about grief as we're learning everything else in our lives? You know, I remember,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I remember someone, this is going to sound terrible, but I don't think it was said in with a bad intent, but someone said, at one point after I lost my father, not that long after I lost my father, is everything going to be about your dad forever?
Wow.
And I said, yeah.
Yeah. Good for you. Good for you.
Yeah, it is. And I think
Yeah.
like, it's just that person had not been through it, like, and so it was like, why do we keep coming back to this thing? And, is it always going to be like this? And it, yes and no, it's not going to be this acute grief phase always. That's mercifully not that long, but yeah, it's always going to come back to this. This is in many ways like my origin story,
Mm-hmm.
and
I
in a way,
think,
like,
oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it's actually kind of a sweet mercy. I've never really thought about this until right now in this conversation, that any of us get any years without the knowledge that we are terminally vulnerable,
Yeah. Wow.
A sweet mercy.
I wrote that quote down too, Julie. That was one of my
It's a good one.
quotes.
Terminally vulnerable.
Terminally vulnerable. But I think that, when someone says, is it always going to be about your dad? And there was, for me, I think the response might be, I'm sorry, my grief makes you so uncomfortable.
Right.
It is going to be about my dad. And I'm sorry that that's making you uncomfortable, but there's nothing I can do about that. That's on you.
Right.
Yeah.
You made a comment there, and I just thought how many times I have thought of that too, when you said, why don't we learn about it? Why don't we understand it? And I remember going into a classroom of grade 8 students, and the teacher had asked if I would go in and talk to the kids, because one of the kids, his dad was palliative and dying, and he was going to be coming back into class. So the teacher said, can you talk to them about how we should accept him back? What should we do, etc. But anyway, the point was, I simply started by asking, how many of you have had somebody in your family die, a grandparent, a dog, something in your family die? All but one kid, there were 19 in the room, all but one kid put their hand up. And it struck me there, like here at grade 8, so they're what, 10, 11, 12 years old, 12 years old or whatever, thinking they've already experienced the grief in so many ways, and yet we are so afraid of, why aren't we helping them understand that at that point?
Right. What's the harm?
What's the harm? Yeah. Wow.
Can we talk about triggers?
Yes.
Because it came up lots through your book. We know it's a symptom of trauma. We know it's a normal one. It's also a very overused word. And I also know there's some issues with that word nowadays too. And I think we're trying to kind of rephrase it to kind of, there's other words we're using, but, you tell a great story in it about spaghetti sauce and, this idea that triggers are portals to the past. And I'm going to hand it over to you and see what would you like to teach us about that?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating moment, because I get really angry sometimes when we misuse words. I had this hilarious student when my first year teaching who used to tell me to mind my diction. And I think of him like 3 times a week because he was saying, mind your diction, like these words matter. We have to get these things straight. And I think, he's right. We have to, like, words matter, we have to pay attention to what we are saying and what these things mean. And I think, trigger is an example of this, where we take a word that has a very specific meaning and we just twist it and twist it and twist it. And the way that I'm saying that is going to come off as very judgmental, and in part it is, but also I'm really curious about that. And I think we should look at, what is it about this moment in time that we're all reaching for this language to describe everything? Because what a trigger is supposed to refer to, what it was originally, meant to signify, were these really uncanny experiences that trauma survivors were having, where they would be in the course of a normal day and all of a sudden they would be thrown back into the past. And this phenomenon goes all the way back to the beginning of the study of trauma in the 1880s. One of the first case studies, Anna O from Freud and Breuer's work, Studies on Hysteria, would hallucinate her old room so much that she would bump into furniture because like the stuff wasn't in the right place, because she thought it was the year before. And so this weird experience where the past comes into and overtakes the present out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, was what this word was supposed to indicate. So you have this fragmented, unprocessed, unintegrated memory that keeps like jutting into the present in these ways that can make your life look really disorganized and scary. And for some reason along the line, we picked up this word and have started applying it to everything we feel ever at any point in
anything distressing or upsetting or
or just inconvenient. Like I don't,
inconvenient.
I don't want to be angry right now. And yet this thing just popped up in my Facebook feed and now I'm angry. And so now I'm triggered. And it's like, no, you're just having a feeling. Like why do we have to make it this big giant thing? And so with the misuse of the word comes a bunch of misconceptions about what it means to heal from trauma, and there are a bunch of misconceptions I talk about in the book. One of them is that we are always conscious of our triggers. Like I saw a meme yesterday about how like your relationship isn't a real relationship until you've walked through and talked about all your triggers. We don't always know what they are.
That's right.
The second misconception is that like we think we can only be triggered by these interpersonal issues because that's, I think, what's getting amplified right now. But you can be triggered by anything. You can be triggered by your own heart rate. You can be triggered by feeling full. You can be triggered by a smell, again, that's not necessarily conscious to you. And then another misconception is that we get this idea that if you have a trigger, this means you get to and should avoid this thing for the rest of your life. And what a trigger actually is like an indicator light. There's something in your brain that needs to be worked on because it's not filed away correctly. And so if your indicator light comes on in your car on the highway, you don't just get out of the car and leave it there, right? You take it in and you figure out what's going on and how you can pay for it, and then you fix it. And so a trigger is your brain trying to get you to notice that you have a memory that hasn't been integrated properly, and that you likely need to do this with other people, because when you try to bring that memory forward, you're likely to get flooded again. And so that's kind of the tension, the trick at the center of treating trauma, is that this memory wants to come forward and be organized. And then at the same time, when we bring it forward, we get thrown back into the response.
My experience with clients is that often their triggers, they're really not aware at all. Like they'll just say to me, the last few days have been really hard, Julie. Like I'm feeling really panicky. I feel like I'm on the verge of a panic attack. And then that's often when I know, you reference, triggers are the portal to the past. I know their nervous system has been activated, probably from something from the past. But, because what we see in, Hollywood movies or whatnot often show this depiction that our triggers are these like visual things and we know what they are, and it's this clear link to this memory, but often it's much more abstract than that.
Yeah. So the spaghetti sauce example from the book was that I love spaghetti, and I would make spaghetti with spaghetti sauce and then immediately become too nauseous to eat it. And this happened once, and you think, okay, well, weird day or whatever, I have flu. Then you do it again, and it kept happening. And I just kept being like, I guess like I can't tolerate tomatoes anymore. I don't know what's happening. Had no connection whatsoever at all to what the trigger was, which is that was the last thing my father ate before he went into the hospital. That was his last meal, was spaghetti with spaghetti sauce. And once I realized that, I could eat spaghetti again. Like it was just the connection of the dots, and also the feeling through. There's something like excruciatingly mundane in that, like you're just eating spaghetti and you think like you're going to go to bed and you're going to go to work tomorrow, and then you're eating spaghetti and then everything ends, and so it carried the significance of that whole event. And it's
And I think that fine tuning that with the trigger, I liked your comment, and the idea that a traumatic memory is not a memory. It's an actual reliving of the experience. It's actually it's as if you are thrown back into the experience, or the experience is thrust forward into your present.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a clinician, Russell Carr, who used to be the head of behavioral health at Walter Reed. I don't know if he still is, who said that the thing that's unique about survivors of trauma is that they're some of the only people who know what it's like to live in two temporalities at once. Because and I want to create like a new like terminology around this, because it really isn't a memory. It is not the same. You are thrown back in this way that is, when we think about our regular memories, you kind of have this idea of like going in and, okay, let me tell me a funny story about when you turned 5 or something. What's the funniest thing that happened when you were in 5th grade? And you'll go through and think about like, oh, there's this funny thing, and you open the file and you put it away. And that's not what trauma memories are like at all. You don't pull them out. They pull you out, you know?
Right. Yeah.
Well, and I know you would have heard this, me talking about my own story with cancer and the trauma. It's so all encompassing. It feels like it's taking you over. That's that roar I call. And when I would have people say to me, but you're okay. Like, here you are, you're okay. And it's like, that's what you can feel like. People don't understand that because you're not feeling in the moment your okayness.
Right.
Your brain is back capsized by that wave of lack of safety and that roar. And in those moments, and I know that's just made me a much more compassionate clinician now, because I understand the power of that. And somebody coming in and saying, but you're okay now. Like, you're okay right now. It's like, yeah, but nothing about my nervous system is hearing that right now.
Right. And that's happening while you're experiencing the treatment, but then also continues.
That's right.
And this is something I've seen with clients that, and you were talking about it in the podcast, about like the threat doesn't go away. And so you have to live with this. I think we have this idea like, oh, you're in remission, and that's great. And it is, of course, but also like the whole like horizon of your life has changed irreparably. And there's no space for that.
And that's part of that rebuilding of a worldview that makes space for that. Right. Because we have to live with that truth now that we know to be true. And even if others can't grasp it, I have to find that space somehow to make sense out of how I live in this world.
Yep.
I know that on that note, I know we wanted to make sure we did give you some space to speak about hypervigilance, because of course that's part of the trauma response too. So can we ask you to speak about that?
Yeah, I think David Morris is a journalist and a veteran who wrote a book called The Evil Hours, which is his biography of PTSD. And he went through prolonged exposure therapy and has a lot to say about it. And he's a tremendous writer. And he says that trauma is a truth that tells a lie.
Yeah.
The glimpse of truth that tells a lie, that peace is an illusion. And I think that, there's arguments for some ridiculous reason about like which thing is the most central thing about traumatic experience. And some people say memory is obviously, where all these symptoms are located. But I think you could equally argue that this hypervigilance that doesn't ever turn off and can totally hijack every second of every day is another huge central experience, because it colors. So hypervigilance is just this idea that your brain is like a sniper scanning for danger, and it's laser focused on what's dangerous. And because of that, anything that appears like it might be a tiny bit dangerous, maybe can become this huge, you can have a huge response to that. And so, veterans will kind of be walking the perimeter of their house. Cognitively, they know that they are home and they are no longer deployed. And yet every single night they are compulsively walking the perimeter as if they are still in deployment, or scanning a room to try to make sure they can find the exits. And this, happens to, that's kind of a more extreme example, but that hypervigilance takes hold in anyone who has trauma. And so instead of these pockets of peace being available to you in your life, everything becomes potential danger. All of your relationships are potentially dangerous. All of your, movements in the world are potentially dangerous. And so it steals all of your joy, all of your rest, and can leave your nervous system profoundly dysregulated. There's a word for, so before I was talking about homeostasis. In a chronically stressful situation, whether that's from trauma or just chronic stress, your system will actually stop seeking the old homeostasis, and it will just make a new normal. And that's called allostasis. It will just level up. And so, and that's, again, it's an adaptive, mechanism that your system is like, okay, like, I guess this is just what it is now. Let's just, level up here, which in a way is a beautiful thing that your body is doing. But on like a hormonal level, you now have stress hormones coursing through your body 24/7 and you're like, I don't know why I can't sleep or relax or like blink my eyes, yeah.
And I think I've heard, I'm sorry, I was just going to comment that I witnessed that in the group where I had with parents who had a child die.
Yeah.
So once one child dies,
right,
the new worldview is all my children can die.
yeah, and they will, and it's a matter of when. Yeah.
It's a matter of when. So they live with that new hypervigilance,
Yeah.
and it's a challenge.
Yeah.
It creates all kinds of relational pieces and challenges for the rest of life.
Yeah, yeah. And
Sorry,
unchecked, it
That's
just
what I was
gets
gonna say.
bigger. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, are there any other examples of how that sort of functions in a grief sort of a context? That's a good example, David. But
Yeah,
are there others?
That's a great example. I think also people not being able to connect because they understand and feel, this is hypothetically and not my personal experience at all, of course, not being able to feel safe in intimate or personal relationships because it's too dangerous, because what the stakes are.
Yeah.
Like it's it can really change your ability to let other people in or to love in as free a way as you might have before. And I think it happens, sometimes people can't get another pet because they have lived through the loss of a pet and they think I can't do that again. And so they, end up opting out of beautiful life experiences because of the threat of danger. And I think it can also corrode trust, right? So these things are like, they spread, right? These beliefs don't stay static and singular. So if you have a child loss and you believe that, it's a matter of time and all of your children are going to be lost, that starts to spread out. And now it's all people in your life. It's your spouse, it's your best friend, it's your sibling, it's your parent. And it's, these things unchecked just get bigger and bigger again, I think, because they are indicator lights. They're trying to get us to do some work or, figure something out or recalibrate the system. And if we don't, it just gets bigger and louder,
So it's kind of a hypervigilance to vulnerability.
Yeah.
Right. To our terminal vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I remember
to put that
one
worldview back together again. Oh, sorry, David.
Exactly. No, but that's what you're right. Trying to put it back together with that piece there. And it's a personal piece. So it's hard.
Yeah.
I was going to comment, one of the parents, I remember we used to every now and then just choose a word to talk about, and somebody had suggested the word hope, and I'll never forget, she said, I can't hope anymore. I'll never be able to hope because I don't want hope to be gone again. It went the last time, and I realized that hope has nothing to hold it. So there's that, and I don't know. It takes years. I think it does. I think you can work on that. But boy, those pieces are huge. And you're right. It erodes so many aspects of our life that allow us to feel at peace and live joyfully. That can be eroded through that. Yeah.
I'm just thinking we probably should start thinking about wrapping up. And before we got online here, we were talking about how your book ends. And I think it's a story of a lost bunny and some ginger ale.
Yeah.
And we were thinking about how that's such a wonderful example of what someone who is in a grieving place needs. And David or Julie, if you can come up with the words that I'm not coming up with right now, throw them in. But we just thought it would be a nice way to end with you telling that story, because it was just such a poignant image of what someone who's grieving actually needs. And so we struggle with not being able to do anything. And we struggle with that sense of how can I help? How can I change? I can't change this. I can't make it better. But the story of your dad doing nothing and making everything okay. Would you share that story with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was, I don't know I think I was like 6 or 8, I had this bunny that someone gave to me when I was in a crib, and I loved it absolutely to pieces, so much so that it didn't even resemble a stuffed animal anymore at the time of this story at 7. It was like how like little kids stuffed animals get so unbelievably ratty. And we had gone to a hotel and stayed in the hotel, and I had slept with the little bunny underneath my pillow and then left it there. And the hotel staff threw it away because they didn't even, they were probably like, what is this weird, washcloth item? This didn't even look like a bunny anymore. But I was bereft. Like you know, especially as a kid, that's your comfort item. And that was what got me to sleep. And so I was really struggling with going to bed at night. And I was also a very intense kid, which is maybe not surprising knowing me now. But my dad, you know, he would put me to sleep. He would put me to sleep and read me a story. And then I would get up like 20 minutes later and I would be crying in the kitchen, and he would pour me a tiny little cup of ginger ale in a rocks glass over some ice. And we would sit at the table, and it was, I swear to God, almost like we were sitting at a bar in the Bronx, like both of us kind of leaning on the table, sipping at this ginger ale and talking about this loss of the bunny. And it was, you know, what did it mean and what did it signify and how did it feel today? And okay, it makes you nauseous. Okay. And it's hard to sleep and you don't know what kind of bunny to get. And do you get another bunny? And do you get the same kind of bunny or do you get a different kind of bunny? Is that disrespectful to the bunny? Should you move on from this stage in your life where you need a bunny? Like all of this stuff I was grappling with. And the whole time he just every single night poured the same glass of ginger ale and just sat next to me and had the same conversation, probably 200 times, because that's what you do when someone is dealing with a loss. I think we get so tripped up in, I don't know what to say and I don't know what to do. And should I bring food? Do I not bring food? And what if I say the wrong thing? And this is only amplified in cancel culture, where we are blowing up relationships for, you know, inappropriate jokes and things like that. That we don't know what to do or say, and that it's not rocket science. You just go and sit.
Yeah.
And that's it. And that's incredibly comforting and grounding.
Yeah. And that's the relational home.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's that place of attunement you talked about. You don't have to have lived experience. You just need to be in tune with the other person, right?
Right. Absolutely. And he never said, you know, oh my God, you got to get over it. This is, you know, it's just a bunny. What is your problem? You got to go to sleep, you know, and that was, I think, you know, really set the foundation for who I am in the world, you know.
He let you have your grief by the sounds of it, right?
Yes.
He didn't try to take it away. He didn't try to smooth it over and make it better. He just sat with you in it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you found your way out eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful example of that relational home. I think it's such a beautiful example of who your father was. And it's also a great example of how, you know, that when you wrote about loss, you said, you know, the loss isn't the whole story. And here we are talking about your dad, that his whole story was not the way he died.
Right.
And that we do find these other ways to, you know, live with them in our world. And for those who should read your book, that little story, that beautiful little gem, is at the very end of the book. And I love that, because it is a message of hope at the end. And it is a message of, you know, what we are to each other through trauma, through grief. And I really am so grateful for this book, your work. I do want to say, like David said at the beginning, it feels like we're having a conversation with you as you read it. I love the odd drop of profanity too, by the way, through it.
Yes.
That just makes me like you and the book even more.
I'm from Massachusetts. I can't not.
Yeah, I loved it. So I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for sharing this book with us and with the world.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that it landed. It's an honor to talk to you three about it, and that you all read it, and it's just lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is where we pile it all on. I'm telling everybody I know to read it.
Oh, yay. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
It
was really so well written and taking complex ideas and concepts and making them so accessible.
Oh, thank you.
And readable. It was a joy to read. It's a weird thing to say. It was a pleasure to read something on that subject matter, but it was so well done.
Someone, a couple of people have said, like, oh, I never thought that a trauma book would be a page turner, but here we are.
Exactly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, MC.
Thank you. This is so lovely.
Thanks for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough. Music by Paradise Garage. Technical support provided by Sean and Jonah Heikert. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio. You can find more episodes of What Now for free on most major podcast platforms. including Spotify, Castbox, Apple Podcasts, and Overcast. If you want to support us, please follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And tell your friends. It does make a difference.